Okay, should we begin? Does everybody have a handout? Yes? All right. Om Purnamadav Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnamevavashishyate Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om, that is full of divine consciousness. This is full of divine consciousness. From the fullness, fullness emerges. Even after removing fullness from fullness, what remains is divine fullness. Om, peace, peace, peace. Welcome everyone to the second of 3 classes on the Isha Upanishad in a new light. Just to recap very briefly what we talked about last week, Swami Vivekananda urged us to reinterpret the Vedāntic scriptures. So that includes the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, and the Brahma Sutra, from the standpoint of Sri Ramakrishna, in the light of the life and teachings of Sri Ramakrishna. And so in these 3 classes, so the first one last week, the second one this week, and the last one next week, next Tuesday, I thought we could begin to explore how we might interpret the Isha Upanishad anew in the light of Sri Ramakrishna. And fortunately, we have some resources to help us. So both Swami Vivekananda and Sri Aurobindo have started this project. Swami Vivekananda did not write full-length commentaries on any of these scriptures. He didn't write a commentary on the Gita or on the Upanishads or Bhagavad Gita. But he made a lot of very insightful remarks about each of these scriptures at different places in the complete works, which we can sort of try to put together and try to systematize in a way. So one of the places that I think is really invaluable is a lecture he delivered called God in Everything, delivered in 1896 in London. And the whole lecture can be seen as a kind of commentary on the Isha Upanishad. So I'll be drawing on that today and next week. And Sri Aurobindo took this project further. And if we remember from last week, he explicitly said, what we need to do is reinterpret the Vedāntic scriptures in the light of the life and teachings of both Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda. And he himself started to do that. And he did so in a very impressive and rigorous way by producing an almost 600-page commentary on the Bhagavad Gita called Essays on the Gita, and writing full commentaries on 2 Upanishads, the Isha Upanishad, which we'll be discussing, and the Guyana Upanishad. And I should also mention, one text I didn't mention last week, but which is very significant, is a text written by Swami Harshanandaji, who was a very senior Swami of our order who passed away recently. He was the head of our Bangalore ashrama for many years, and a great scholar. And he wrote a very unique new commentary on the Isha Upanishad in Sanskrit called Viveka Sukhavardhini, which was then translated into English by the current head of Bangalore, Nityasthanandaji. And Chennai Math has published a bilingual edition of Harshanandaji's book, facing page, so the left page has the Sanskrit written by Harshanandaji, and the right page has Nityasanandaji's English translation of Harshanandaji's Sanskrit. And what's unique about this commentary is that Harshanandaji has basically attempted what Swamiji wanted, which is reinterpreting the Isha Upanishad from the standpoint of Sri Ramakrishna and Swamiji, Swami Vivekananda. So I also strongly recommend that text for any of you who are interested in going more deeply into this scripture. So as I mentioned last week, Isha Upanishad, even though it's one of the shortest Upanishads, it still has 18 mantras, and that's far too many to discuss in 3 classes. So today, we are just going to discuss in some detail the first and second mantras of this Upanishad, and we'll cover a few more mantras next week. And if any of you are interested in a more systematic and in-depth study of all of the mantras, you can look at one of my scholarly articles called Seeing Oneness Everywhere, Sri Aurobindo's mystico-immanent interpretation of the Isha Upanishad. You can find it on my academia.edu website if you just type in my name on Google. So let's begin without further ado. So the first mantra is as follows. I'll read the Sanskrit first. And since all of you have a handout, it would be good if you can repeat after me. So I'll read about a fourth of the mantra, and then please repeat after me. Isha vasyam idam sarvam yat kincha jagatyam jagat tena tyaktena bhunjitha magrida kasya svidhanam. Okay, so for now we're just focusing on the first line of this first mantra. Isha in Sanskrit means by God or by the Lord. It's the third, Tritiya Vibhakti, the third case, instrumental case, so by God. Vasyam. This is the first word, which is very difficult to translate. And so every translation of this Upanishad, and for that matter, any scripture really, any text, any interpretation is at the same time, any translation is at the same time an interpretation. There's no strictly neutral translation of a text. So if you get 5 translations of the Isha Upanishad in English, each of them will be different in significant ways, because every word can be interpreted in different ways. And so this is one of the tricky issues when interpreting the Isha Upanishad, and particular words like vasyam, the second word. So right above the Sanskrit in the handout is Sri Aurobindo's translation. But remember that this is already inflected by his own interpretation. So this is how Sri Aurobindo interprets this first mantra. All this is for habitation by the Lord. Whatsoever is individual universe of movement in the universal motion. By that renounced, thou shouldest enjoy. Lust not after any man's possession. Now, before we move into Sri Aurobindo's interpretation of this mantra, let me discuss briefly Shankara's interpretation. It's on the handout right below the Sanskrit of the mantra. So according to Shankara, the meaning of the first line of the first mantra is that, and this is a quotation, all this that is unreal. So the original Sanskrit here is anritam idam sarvam. Whether moving or not moving, is to be covered, acchadaniyam, by one's own supreme Atman. So he makes a lot of moves here, which are quite interesting. First of all, in this first mantra, it says, Isha vasyam idam sarvam. Idam sarvam means all this, and it means this entire universe. What Shankara does, he adds another adjective before idam sarvam, anritam, which means unreal. So he's saying that all this unreal universe. But the question is, does the Upanishad itself suggest that this world is unreal? That's the first question I want to raise. And I don't want to answer it for you. I want each of you to think for yourselves about what you think the answer might be. But this is the first controversial thing he does. He throws in the word unreal before idam sarvam. Secondly, remember I said Isha means by God. And Ish means ruler of the universe. What Shankara does is he interprets this Ish, this personal God, as the impersonal Atman. Because remember the quotation, this world is to be covered by one's own supreme Atman. So again, he's interpreting the word Ish, which is meant to be the personal God, arguably, intuitively. Now he's interpreting it as the impersonal Atman. And even more importantly, how does he understand covered? So he's saying that this entire unreal world is to be covered by the Atman. What he's saying is that because this world is unreal, we should cover it with the reality, and the only reality is the Atman. And he goes so far as to liken this world, this unreal world, to a stench, to a bad odor. And he says that we should cover this bad odor with the nice fragrance of the non-dual Atman. This is the metaphor he uses. So this is Shankara's interpretation. Now, we can ask now, is there a different and arguably better way of interpreting this first verse in the light of Sri Ramakrishna? So let's begin by looking at something Sri Ramakrishna says. This comes from the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna in an entry dated 16th December 1883. It's in the handout. Mohandranath Gupta, the author of the Gospel, he asked Sri Ramakrishna a very direct question. Is the world unreal? Jagat ki mitha? And then Sri Ramakrishna answers as follows. He says, why should the universe be unreal? That is the view of Advaitic Gyanis. After realizing God, one sees that it is God herself who has become the universe and all living beings. The Bangla here is, Jagat mitha keno hobe? O shob bicharer kotha. Taake darshan hole tokhon boja jay je tini jeev jagat hoyechen. So anyone who has attended my previous class should strike a bell, because I discussed last week Sri Ramakrishna's teachings on Vigyana, and he said exactly the same thing about the realization of the Vigyani. Vigyani dekhe Brahmai Choturbingshi Tattva hoyechen. The Vigyani sees that Brahman itself has become the 24 cosmic principles. It has become everything in this universe. So what he's saying, Sri Ramakrishna, in his response to M's very pointed question, is the world unreal? He says, the world is perceived as unreal by Advaita Gyanis, but there's a greater state than that, called Vigyana, in which one sees the world not as unreal, but as a real and joyful manifestation of God. So now, what I would suggest is that both Swami Vivekananda and Sri Aurobindo reinterpret the Isha Upanishad from Sri Ramakrishna's standpoint of Vigyana. So how do they do this? First, let's look at a passage from Swami Vivekananda's lecture, God and Everything, where he discusses this first mantra. And this is what he says. It's on the handout. Here I can only lay before you what the Vedanta seeks to teach, and that is the deification of the world. The Vedanta does not, in reality, denounce the world. It really means deification of the world. Giving up the world as we think of it, as we know it, as it appears to us, and to know what it really is. Deify it. It is God alone. Then I put this in bold because it's his direct interpretation of the first mantra of Isha Upanishad. We read at the commencement of one of the oldest of the Upanishads, by which he means the Isha Upanishad. Whatever exists in this universe is to be covered with the Lord. We have to cover everything with the Lord himself, not by a false sort of optimism, not by blinding our eyes to the evil, but by really seeing God in everything. So notice that in this passage, Swami Vivekananda is implicitly deviating from Shankara's interpretation. So he accepts Shankara's understanding of Vasyam as to be covered. This world should be covered. Swami Vivekananda agrees with that. But Shankara says, in the way that we cover up a bad odor with a nice fragrance, which is our Atman. And Swami Vivekananda is saying, cover the world in the sense of seeing God in everything. See the world as God. This is the difference. And Sri Aurobindo follows both Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda in defending a similar interpretation of this first verse. This is a bit long, but I thought it's important to give you a taste of Sri Aurobindo's own writing from his commentary on the Isha Upanishad. So I'll be reading this quotation now. It's the second to last bullet point on the first page of the handout. Sri Aurobindo says, there are three possible senses of Vasyam: to be clothed, to be worn as a garment, and to be inhabited. The first is the ordinarily accepted meaning. Shankara explains it in this significance that we must lose the sense of this unreal objective universe in the sole perception of the pure Brahman. So explained, the first line becomes a contradiction of the whole thought of the Upanishad, which teaches the reconciliation by the perception of essential unity of the apparently incompatible opposites, God in the world, renunciation and enjoyment, action and internal freedom, the one and the many, being and its becomings, the passive divine impersonality and the active divine personality, the knowledge and the ignorance, the becoming and the not becoming, life on earth and beyond, and the supreme immortality. The image is of the world either as a garment or as a dwelling place for the informing and governing spirit. The latter significance agrees better with the thought of the Upanishad. So this is a very dense passage, but let's try to unpack it a little bit. So first of all, Sri Aurobindo is reminding us of his main thesis about the Isha Upanishad, which is that the entire Upanishad's aim is to reconcile apparent opposites, to show that what seem to be opposites are in fact not opposites at all, but actually complementary. And he goes through the Upanishad systematically and points out different opposites, which he kind of summarizes in that long sentence in the middle of the passage that I just read. The first mantra aims to harmonize the apparent opposites of God on the one hand, who is supposed to be perfect and omniscient and eternal, and on the other hand, the world, which is supposed to be full of evil and suffering and impermanent and changing, right? And he's explicitly mentioning and taking issue with Shankara's interpretation of this, saying that there's no evidence in the text itself that this world is unreal. And in fact, it's much more plausible to interpret this mantra as declaring to us that each one of us, as spiritual aspirants, should strive to see this world afresh as a manifestation of God. Isha vasamidam sarvam. Not dismiss it as unreal, but to try to see God in everything. Now we can get to the second line of the first mantra. Let me read it again. Tena tyaktena bhunjitaha ma grida kasya svidhanam. Here again, we have this one extremely controversial word. In the first line, the controversial word was vasyam. In the second line, the really controversial word is bhunjitaha. It's an imperative. It's telling us, the Upanishad is telling us to do something. But what is it telling us to do? Different commentators have very different interpretations of this. The issue is that bhunjitaha comes from the verbal root bhuj, the dhatu bhuj. And it's conjugated. In Sanskrit, there are two forms of conjugation, atmanepadi and parasmaipadi. And it's conjugated in the atmanepadi form. And according to Panini's grammar, which is the standard grammar which all the acharyas, including Shankara, accepted, according to Panini's grammar, the atmanepadi conjugation of bhuj, in the imperative form, bhunjitaha, means only one of two things. It can mean eat or enjoy. If it had been conjugated differently in the other form, the parasmaipadi form, then you can interpret the same word as protect. Okay, this is slightly technical, but I'm explaining it for a reason here. The reason is, Shankaracharya, while usually, in almost all cases, he's very faithful to Panini's Sanskrit grammar. He almost never deviates from Panini's Sanskrit grammar. In this case, he's stuck. Because unless he deviates from Panini's grammar, he has to interpret bhunjitaha as enjoy or eat, which does not accord with his Advaitic philosophy. So what does he do? He says that even though the word is conjugated in the atmanepadi form, and so its meaning should be eat or enjoy, in this case we should take it in its parasmaipadi form, which means to protect. Protect. The Upanishad is telling us to protect through enunciation. Protect what? This is the next problem. Because it doesn't specify in the verse what needs to be protected, if it really means protect. So the first problem is he's explicitly deviating from Panini's grammar. And the second thing is, if it means protect, protect is a word which in all languages, in Sanskrit and in English, requires a direct object. Something needs to be protected. So he says you have to protect the Atman. And the question is, where is the Atman in this mantra? So this is another problem. So he says it's implied. You should protect what? Square brackets, the Atman. So this is how Shankara interprets the second line. You should protect the Atman through renunciation of all action and just focus on your true nature as the non-dual Atman. Now, again, we can ask ourselves, is there a different and perhaps more fruitful way of interpreting the second line of this first verse of the Isha Upanishad? And again, we can take our guiding light from Sri Ramakrishna. Sri Ramakrishna says the following. This is taken from the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, October 16th, 1883. It's in the handout, in about the middle of the handout on the second page. He says, the aspirant, while practicing spiritual discipline, looks upon the world as a framework of illusion. The Bengali is dhoka tati. Again, after the attainment of knowledge, the vision of God, this very world becomes to him a mansion of mirth, mojar kuti in Bengali. What Sri Ramakrishna is saying here, as far as I understand it, is that the ultimate spiritual attainment is one in which you just see the world as full of joy. Why do you see the world as full of joy? Because you see the world as God, and God is by definition joy. Another one of the oldest Upanishads is called Taittiriya Upanishad, and it gives a definition of God. The definition is raso vai saha, raso vai. Saha, Brahman, the ultimate reality is rasaha. It's bliss. It's ananda. So why wouldn't you be joyful if you see nothing but God in this world? So if we can unpack the statement of Sri Ramakrishna's, we can distinguish maybe three standpoints. There's a standpoint of ignorant worldly people. Ignorant of what? Ignorant of God. These are people who have not realized God, who are maybe not even interested in God or don't believe in God. What do? They enjoy this world, but in what sense? They enjoy this world minus God. They don't see God in the world. What does enjoyment mean for them? It means that they have all sorts of worldly desires. When they fulfill one of those desires, they get a little bit of happiness, a little bit of joy, very, very briefly. And the next moment it vanishes, and then it also brings a nice truckload of sorrow along with it usually. It depends on the kind of worldly pleasure it is. And that's the way this world has been going on. For most people, enjoyment of the world means I have certain desires, I find something in the world that fulfills my desire, and I get happiness when that desire is fulfilled, but it lasts a very brief period of time, and then I suffer for it ultimately in the end. That's the first standpoint, and that's the kind of enjoyment that most people indulge in. The second standpoint we can say is the standpoint of Sri Ramakrishna, what Sri Ramakrishna called the Gyani, which corresponds to Shankara's standpoint, Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya, somebody who's completely free from these worldly desires and who has realized his or her true nature as the non-dual Atman. He sees, when he comes back to the world, if he or she comes back to the world as a Jivan Mukta, you'll see the entire world as a kind of mirage. You'll see through the world into the ultimate reality, which is Brahman. Just imagine that you're walking in a desert and you see something from far off. You think it's water. When you come close to it, you realize there's no water there. It's just a mirage. In that way, the Gyani sees this entire world as a kind of mirage. So that's the second standpoint, the Gyani standpoint. He sees, the Gyani sees God minus the world. And by God here, I mean his own Atman, or her own Atman. You see Atman, but minus the world. And then there's a third standpoint, the standpoint of what Sri Ramakrishna called the Vigyani. This is the person who sees the world as God. He or she sees the world as God, and because everything in the world is God, the Vigyani enjoys the world in a radically different sense from the ignorant worldly person. The person who has realized God in everything enjoys the world in the sense that it's a desireless enjoyment. There's no desire. And instead, there's just ananda. The Vigyani's own ananda within, because he or she has discovered God within, is also the same ananda without. So there's nothing but joy, inside and outside. This is why Sri Ramakrishna talks about the Vigyani's realization of the world as a mojar kuti, as a mansion of mirth, as a mart of joy. So these are the three standpoints. And I think what the Isha Upanishad is talking about, if we try to analyze it from the standpoint of Sri Ramakrishna, is the Vigyani's kind of enjoyment. This is not enjoyment based on the fulfillment of worldly desires, but enjoyment of the world by seeing it as nothing but God. And this is exactly what Swami Vivekananda says. So please look at the handout. in his lecture, God and Everything, this is his interpretation of the second line of the first mantra of the Isha Upanishad. He says, when we have given up desires, tena tyaktena, then alone shall we be able to read and enjoy this universe of God. Notice, he's very clearly not following Shankara and interpreting bhunji taha as protect the Atman or anything. He's taking it as enjoy. And what kind of enjoyment is this? This is desireless enjoyment of the world by seeing God in everything, right? And Sri Aurobindo follows both Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda in interpreting the second line of the first verse in exactly the same way. So this is also on the handout. Sri Aurobindo says the following: real integral enjoyment of all this movement and multiplicity in its truth and in its infinity depends upon an absolute renunciation. But the renunciation intended is an absolute renunciation of the principle of desire, founded on the principle of egoism, and not a renunciation of world existence. So this is just a little bit more sophisticated way of saying the same thing that Swami Vivekananda is saying. He's saying that to truly enjoy this world, we have to renounce all of our desires. So he's saying that renunciation does not mean you stop acting in the world, you stop doing whatever your duty was, and you just practice Jnana Yoga and focus on your true Atman. No, you continue to do all of your duties. You do everything that's required of you in this world. If you're a householder, you still look after your kids, you take your kids to school, you spend time with your spouse, all these things. But at the same time, you can enjoy the world if you can remove desire from the equation. If you're free from desire, you can truly enjoy the world as God. And it does not require renunciation in the sense of stopping all actions. So now, this is a useful segue to the second mantra of the Isha Upanishad. So I'll repeat the first quarter of it, and then I'll ask you to repeat it. Kurvanneveha karmani jijivishet shatam samaha evam tvai nanyatheto osti na karma lipyate nare. Okay. So let's read Sri Aurobindo's translation of the second mantra. This is what he says. Doing verily works in this world, one should wish to live 100 years. Thus it is in thee and not otherwise than this. Action cleaves not to a man. So let's begin this time not with Shankara but with Swami Vivekananda and Sri Aurobindo, and then we'll get to Shankara's interpretation. So this is how Swami Vivekananda translates and interprets the second mantra. He says, from the same lecture, God and Everything, he says, desire to live 100 years. Have the desire to live a long life of helpfulness, of blissfulness, and activity on this earth. Thus working, you will find the way out. There is no other way. So work, says the Vedanta, putting God in everything and knowing Him to be in everything. So we can say that Swami Vivekananda is interpreting this mantra very directly. The mantra seems to be saying we should strive to live for 100 years while working, and that's exactly how Swami Vivekananda is interpreting it. Sri Aurobindo does the same thing. He says, life and works can and should be accepted in their fullness. For the manifestation of the Lord in life and works is the law of our being and the object of our world existence. So notice that in the case of both Swami Vivekananda and Sri Aurobindo, they're able to interpret this second mantra very naturally because they see it as flowing from the previous mantra. The previous mantra is telling us that this entire world, if you see it correctly, is nothing but God. So if this world is nothing but God, why should you renounce the world? You don't have to renounce the world. You can continue to be doing everything in the world that you were doing, except on a spiritual basis. That's the idea. So some things you have to stop doing. Anything that's based on worldly desire, you have to stop doing. Or you have to do it without the desire, right? So this is the idea. Now, in the case of Shankara, it's much more complicated. The reason is that he interprets the first mantra very differently from Swami Vivekananda and Sri Aurobindo. And that's why he's forced to interpret the second mantra in a very different way. Remember again, first mantra, he's claiming, is stating that we should cover this stinky, unreal world, this world which is unreal, which is likened to a bad odor, with the true reality, which is our own Atman, the non-dual Atman. How do we do this? By renouncing all actions and practicing Jnana Yoga, the Advaitic path of Jnana Yoga, Shravana, Manana, Nididhyasana. We listen to the Mahavakyas, Tattvamasi, Aham Brahmasmi. We reflect on those teachings, and then we meditate on our true nature as Atman, and then we realize our true nature as Atman. And we protect the Atman, he says, through this renunciation of all actions. So this is to him, so the highest spiritual practice for Shankara is Jnana Yoga. It's the path of knowledge. But now what he says is, so how does he explain the second mantra? If the first mantra is saying renounce all actions and just focus on Jnana Yoga, focus on your true nature as the Atman, suddenly the second mantra is saying, Kurvan neveha karmani jijivishet shatagga samaha. Continuing to act in this world, strive to live up to 100 years. How does he reconcile the second mantra with the first mantra? What he does is something very ingenious. It's one of the trusty tools in the Advaitic toolkit for interpreting scriptures. It's the doctrine of Adhikari Bheda. Adhikari Bheda is the doctrine of differing competencies. The idea is that different spiritual aspirants are at different levels of development. And according to Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, only extremely evolved spiritual aspirants are qualified to practice the path of knowledge, Jnana Yoga. And so what he says is, the first mantra is addressed to the highest spiritual aspirants who are qualified for the highest practice of the path of knowledge. Whereas the second mantra suddenly shifts gears and is addressing inferior spiritual aspirants who are not qualified to practice the path of knowledge and who are therefore only qualified to practice karma yoga, the path of selfless action. So this is the beauty of it. He brings this Adhikari Bheda in many, many times in the Bhagavad Gita commentary, for instance. Because the Bhagavad Gita, the whole text is about karma yoga. And so Shankara says, yes, of course, he's talking about karma yoga, but Arjuna is an inferior spiritual aspirant. So that's why he's talking about karma yoga. So anyway, so now, then the question comes again, is it plausible to think that the first mantra of the Upanishad addresses superior spiritual aspirants, and that suddenly the second mantra addresses inferior spiritual aspirants? Again, that's an open question, and I want you to think about this for yourself. But Sri Aurobindo thinks not. And so Sri Aurobindo, I put, this is the second to last bullet on the second page of the handout. He says that Shankara's reading of the second mantra as a concession to the ignorant is forced and unnatural. And Sri Aurobindo is not alone in thinking this. There are a number of scholars, including Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan and our own Swami, I mentioned, the Swami who wrote his own Sanskrit commentary on the Isha Upanishad. He also takes Shankara to task for this interpretation. Harshananda also agree with Sri Aurobindo that Shankara is not justified in claiming that the second mantra is meant for inferior spiritual aspirants, because there's no evidence in the text itself that it's meant for inferior aspirants and not for, it's much more natural to take the Upanishads to be addressing the same audience throughout. And what we'll find in subsequent classes is that throughout the Upanishad, depending on what the message of the mantra is, Shankara will say, well, this mantra is meant for inferior aspirants, this mantra is meant for superior aspirants. So anything relating to the path of knowledge is for superior aspirants. Anything relating to karma or bhakti is suddenly for inferior aspirants. And he goes kind of back and forth. And it becomes a hodgepodge where some mantras are meant for the inferior aspirants, some mantras are meant for the superior aspirants. And that's the way his commentary goes. And so we can ask this question to ourselves, whether that is plausible. Or maybe it's plausible in the case of some mantras and not others. So Okay, so I'll conclude today on this because this is a lot of heavy material, and I'd like to. I've already raised a lot of issues here, and so I'd like to hear from you if you have questions. And next week we will discuss a number of further mantras. Yeah.
How does Vigyana? How does Vigyana, as we're interpreting it in the life of Sri Ramakrishna, differ from panentheism?
Yeah. So how does the realization of the Vigyani differ from panentheism? I don't think it differs. Panentheism is a term that's used a lot nowadays in philosophy of religion. And it means, in general, what it means is, so there's a term called pantheism, which is probably more well known to most of you. Pantheism means God is this world, but nothing over and above this world. That's pantheism. Theism means God, pan means everything. So everything is God, but God is nothing. God's nature is exhausted by this world. Panentheism adds this little en in between the pan on the one hand and theism. There's this little en, which means in Latin in. It means God is in the world. This world is God. But God is not exhausted by this world. God also is transcendent. He is both immanent in this world. I'm saying I-M-M-A-N-E-N-T. He is in this world. But God is not God's nature is not exhausted by the world. God is also transcendent. And so this is a rough definition of panentheism. Of course, different philosophers will interpret panentheism in very different ways. But in general, yes, very much so. I think that Sri Ramakrishna, when he talks about the Vigyani seeing God, this entire world as God, that is a realization of panentheism. The Vigyani sees God not only as this world, but also as beyond this world. So I think it is a kind of panentheism.
I just want to go back to sort of Sri Aurobindo's, when he's talking about the renunciation intended to enjoy the world must be desireless. But to enjoy the world, does he's talking about desireless based on the egoic principle of desire,
right.
correct?
That's right. Yeah.
He doesn't at all differentiate between desire as egoic or non-egoic.
He does.
Okay, that was, I guess, my question.
Yeah, I didn't mention that, but so, I mean, this goes back again to one of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. Sri Ramakrishna would say that Ishvara Kotis, who are these divinely commissioned souls, like incarnations of God and people who accompany an incarnation, they come here not because of their own karma, but in order to help the world. They come here to uplift humanity spiritually. That's a desire, but it's a spiritual desire. It's one not based on egoism. And I think that's exactly the kind of desire that is encouraged in the Isha Upanishad. Thanks.
Swami, a two-part question. Since you quoted that a lot of different Swamis and sages like Aurobindo and even Swamis from our own order have taken exception to Shankara's view of superior versus inferior sadhakas.
Some agree with it, others disagree with it, yeah.
So I was wondering, is it possible that it's not superior versus inferior that he's referring to, but more like temperamental differences? Like some have the temperament to be this Gyani type and some are more action-oriented. Yeah. So that's the first part. The second part
Okay, well, let's take them one at a time. We have time, so I'll come back to you. But so that's a good question. I wish he had said that, but he didn't. So because that actually comes closer to Sri Ramakrishna's position. Sri Ramakrishna would say it's a matter of temperament. Bhaktas like to eat sugar. Gyanis want to become sugar. But Shankara clearly says, it's in the Sanskrit, where he says, those who are incapable of practicing Jnana Yoga, for them, the second mantra says, try to act in the world as much as possible and live up to 100 years. So it really is a matter of differing competencies. That's exactly what people take issue with, yeah. But so now go ahead and, yeah.
But isn't incapacity essentially a statement of your temperament?
I don't see that.
I mean, it's not like a qualifier rather than I'm more action-oriented. That doesn't make me less
I agree with what you're
inferior.
saying. I'm just saying Shankara didn't say that, and I wish he had.
Okay. So in the,
I mean, look, it's just simple. It's like, I can temperamentally want to do a PhD, but am I qualified to do a PhD? Do I have a master's degree? If I don't have the master's, I can't do the PhD. Even if I feel like doing it, even if I desperately want to do it, I still can't do it.
Right.
That's Shankara's view.
Okay. So in the path of Karma Yoga, that I heard that Swamiji opened up this new path for God realization, that is Karma Yoga and Karma Yoga alone can take you to the highest. Mm-hmm. Is this in light of what we are discussing, that whereas Shankara's view and the old view was that Karma Yoga was only a preparatory tool or a mechanism, whereas now it can be the end all be all, the solo path or the lone path that you take?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. So, as you point out, traditional commentators, they tend to see Karma Yoga as a kind of preparatory discipline, preliminary discipline, in order to purify our minds. So according to Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, through the practice of Karma Yoga, selfless work in the world, we purify our minds, thereby making ourselves ultimately eligible to practice the higher practice of Jnana Yoga, which alone can take us to liberation, the knowledge of Brahman. Right? Ramanuja, for instance, who was a bhakta, he was a proponent of Vishishtadvaita Vedanta, he also conceived Karma Yoga as a kind of preparatory discipline. Karma Yoga cannot take us to the highest. He says that also, Karma Yoga is meant to purify the mind in conjunction with what he called Jnana Yoga, which is actually different from Shankara's Jnana Yoga. It's meditation on our true nature as an eternal soul, separate from the body-mind complex. So when we combine the practice of Karma Yoga with Jnana Yoga, we realize our true spiritual nature as a soul, and then we are qualified to practice Bhakti Yoga. So you see how it beautifully turns the tables on Shankara here. Shankara says that Karma Yoga is a preparatory discipline to make us qualified to practice Jnana Yoga. Ramanuja says that the combined practice of Karma Yoga and Jnana Yoga, in a totally different sense from Shankara, makes us eligible to practice Bhakti Yoga, which is the only direct path to liberation. And these arguments have been going on for millennia between the different acharyas, the proponents and philosophers of different philosophical traditions. And your question is a very good one. Your question is, wasn't Swami Vivekananda's contribution that Karma Yoga itself can take us to the highest without the help of other yogas? And I think the answer is yes. He says it explicitly in a number of places. He says that each of our yogas is fitted to make man perfect, even without the help of the others. This is a direct quotation. So, yes, he says that. And I think these kinds of scriptural statements, like the second mantra of the Isha Upanishad, a number of shlokas from the Bhagavad Gita. For instance, there's a famous shloka, Karmaneva hi samsiddhim asita janakadeyaha, loka sangramevapi sampashan kattumahasi. Karmana eva hi samsiddhim asita janakadeyaha. Janaka, King Janaka, the famous King Janaka, who was a king. He was not a renunciate. He was not a monk. He was doing all sorts of kingly activities. He achieved perfection through karma eva, karmana eva, through karma alone. You see? So one can easily interpret these kinds of statements, the second mantra of Isha Upanishad, this shloka from the Bhagavad Gita, through the lens of Swami Vivekananda and Sri Ramakrishna and Sri Aurobindo, that through Karma Yoga itself, without having to practice any other yoga, you can attain the highest goal. Yes, Maharaj. Sorry?
Master also said, by doing good karmas, your mind becomes purified. When it is Shuddha Man, Shuddha Buddhi, then Shuddha mind means your intelligence is also purified.
Yes.
And Shuddha Buddhi is Shuddha Atma. That is also equal to Shuddha Atma. Shuddha Atma is Brahman.
Yes, that's very helpful, Maharaj. Yes, thank you. Yes. So Sri Ramakrishna, one of his teachings, the one that Maharaj is referring to, Swami Sumanasanandaji, is Sri Ramakrishna would say, Shuddha Mon, Shuddha Buddhi, Shuddha Atma Ek. The pure mind, the pure buddhi, pure intelligence, and the pure Atman are one and the same. And we can link this to what Swami Vivekananda was saying. You might ask, the next question, the follow-up question might be, well, okay, it's one thing to say that Karma Yoga and all the yogas are direct paths to the highest, but what's the mechanism? How is it that Karma Yoga can take us to the highest? And this is where I think Sri Ramakrishna's teaching can help us. He says the same thing. Yeah, exactly. What he says is, we already have that knowledge within us. We don't need anything to give us that knowledge. That knowledge is already within us. It's latent within us. The whole point of spiritual practice is to remove the veils of ignorance and impurity covering that knowledge which is already innate in us. This is one way I think this is Swami Vivekananda's way of interpreting Sri Ramakrishna's teaching. The pure mind, the pure buddhi, and the pure atma are one and the same.
He is not telling to do ordinary karma. When his karma becomes karma yoga, you are seeing what you are thinking in the path of knowledge, meditating on the Brahman inside. You are seeing the same Brahman, the presence of reflection of that Brahman outside. So you get a direct communion plus realization also, experience of what you are doing. It is not that you are doing something else. And you are seeing the goal itself, God in everything, Atman in everything, Brahman in everything.
Yeah, that's right.
So karma becomes karma yoga. It brings direct communion with the object of your meditation.
This is another nice point. Maharaj is saying that there's a world of difference between karma and karma yoga. So not all actions are karma yoga. You have to make it a yoga by removing the ego from it, removing desire and removing egoism from the work. When you do that, that becomes a direct path to God realization. Thank you, Maharaj. I think you had a question. Then we'll go back. Yeah.
Maharaj, my question is that you said a different interpretation as given by Swami Vivekananda in today's age. But what you were saying cover the bad sting, which is the Maya, with fragrant, which is Atma. But that's what I think everybody said all the time, in my understanding, that it is full of illusion and try to see the reality through this illusion because God really. So I don't see how is their interpretation any different than from the ancient? That's one question.
Okay, let's go one at a time because I think it's also easier for others to follow and instead of having three questions. So regarding that question, so the first question is, so don't Sri Aurobindo and Swamiji also say that the world is unreal? And in the case of Sri Aurobindo, the answer is very easy. The answer is no. He definitely rejects that view of the world. He says that the world is real. It's real as a manifestation of God. When it comes to Swami Vivekananda, it's a very controversial question, and different scholars have interpreted Swami Vivekananda in many different ways. Some interpret him as a follower of Shankara, and others interpret him more as a follower of Sri Ramakrishna, like I do, and as a number of people like Jeffrey Long, who's a scholar who lives in Pennsylvania. I think he gives lectures here once in a while. And Swami Tapasanandaji, who is the vice president of our order. So there are a few monks in our order and some scholars who have also interpreted Swami Vivekananda this way. So that's a more controversial question. But if we want to go back to traditional Vedantic schools, for instance, every Vedantic school other than Advaita Vedanta denies that the world is an illusion. They say that the world is real. The ignorance is that we don't see God in the world. That's the problem. It's not that the world is unreal. It's that ignorant people, instead of seeing the world as based on God and as a manifestation of God, they only see the nama rupa, the names and forms, minus God. Remember, that's why I put that first standpoint. They see matter. Whereas the realized soul sees, he sees, that person sees matter, but matter as a manifestation of God. This is the way that God playfully manifests. Sri Ramakrishna once had a beautiful realization, which he talks about in the Gospel. He says, one day I was doing puja, worship, ritualistic worship, and suddenly I saw that the puja vessels I was using were nothing but divine consciousness. A cat walked into the room. I saw the cat as nothing but divine consciousness. I saw the door sill as nothing but divine consciousness. He's pointing out different namarupa, different names and forms, each one of which he saw as a real manifestation of divine consciousness. Not as unreal. That's right. I mean, he's feeding the cat, seeing it as Kali, as his own divine mother. Yeah, now second question?
The second question is really... I read Nikhilananda Maharaj's translations also, and for me it's very comprehensible and very doable. So is there something I'm missing?
Well, he generally follows Shankara, so whether you find that missing or not depends on whether you agree with Shankara's interpretation.
Nikhilananda does what?
He follows Shankara's interpretation.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think Jeet had a question in the back.
Thank you, Swami. It's more of an observation, and it's very enlightening and also very helpful. Your explanation. And I shared the same thing a couple of months back in a different class. Whenever you say, not you per se, in the scriptures, that it's not real, nothing is real, it's almost like we're working with a denial. We're denying. We see everything in front of our eyes, and we're denying. It's harder to work that way rather than when we say, there's something beyond what we see. If we see a beautiful scenery or mountain, it triggers some kind of beauty in our. But our nature is also very restless. And then we find that, the restlessness in that even if we fulfill our desires and we get happiness, momentary, fleeting happiness, we still are restless. So there's something beyond that what we see with our eyes. That it's almost like what you just shared with Ramakrishna, the framework of illusion. It's almost like the world is like a riddle. And if you solve it, then you get pleasure out of it, happiness. So that's what I like what you explained today. That instead of denying that this is all unreal and this, that, work with what we already have. Whatever we see, use that to reach the oneness with the Atman.
That's right. Yeah. It makes the path easier in a way. This is part of the reason why in Bhagavad Gita, in chapter 12, Bhagavan Krishna says that the path of bhakti is easier and more pleasant than the path of knowledge.
Well, that's
because you're not violently denying, the reality of this world or kind of.
And there's more incentive and all tangibles, intangibles, or experiences, everything.
Everything becomes an opportunity
is just one
for sadhana,
energy. It's one energy. It's part of one thing.
That's right. Yeah. And Sri Ramakrishna would say, you have these 6 enemies, lust and greed and these other things. What do you do with them? Can you just get rid of them? No, most people can't. More firye though. Give it a divine turn. Give these lower impulses a Godward turn. Turn them toward God. What does it mean to turn lust toward God? Desire God and God alone. In the way that we pant for breath when we're immersed underwater for a long time. What about greed? Instead of greed for money, have greed for God, right? So again, this is another way that we can kind of think in this iti way rather than this neti way. Yeah, divinize everything in this world, in even our own nature.
If you're angry at somebody, you get angry at God instead.
Yeah, well, you can. Sri Ramakrishna was very angry with Kali because she wouldn't reveal herself to him. He was about to cut his throat because of it. And then she said, okay. And then she had this amazing realization. Sorry?
If you're angry be angry at God.
Yeah.
In a loving way.
Yeah, he called that tamasika bhakti, actually. He said that tamasik bhakta is somebody who says, you're not showing yourself to me. It's like, like a Girish Ghosh, and there's certain people who have a kind of tamasik bhakta temperament. And what's funny about it is that normally when Sri Ramakrishna talks about the 3 gunas, usually sattva gets the laurels, the highest. In this case, even the tamasika bhakta seems to be something like his own, the kind of bhakti he had before his first realization. And so Girish was very smart. Girish Ghosh, the great playwright, he was a very intellectual person. So the moment Sri Ramakrishna said that, he smiled and he said, wait a minute, but you're praising tamasika bhakti. And he admitted it. Sri Ramakrishna smiled and admitted it. So it's one of the few places where tamas is good, to be a tamasic bhakta. Yeah, any other questions?
Thank you. 2 questions, if I can. First, real quick, in potential defense of Shankara, was he considered enlightened, a Gyani?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
He was?
Oh, yeah.
After these interpretations. So...
Well, hold on. Let's go back to the last class, which is this, remember. See, when these acharyas interpreted the scriptures, one of their main aims was to show that those scriptures supported their philosophical standpoint. Right? That was one of their primary aims. So there are 2 different things. One is you have a realization, you've realized God in a certain form or the ultimate reality, you've realized your true essence. And there's another separate question, which is, I've got this text in front of me and I need to interpret it and somehow square it with my own philosophy. I think that's where Shankara gets in trouble, is because he's had this realization where he has this deep spiritual conviction based on his realization that this world is a dream and that the only reality is non-dual Brahman. But he's finding in these scriptures that they're not necessarily always saying that. And so in passages which don't directly support Advaita, he has to resort to what Swami Vivekananda called text torturing. So,
Got it.
Yeah.
But in his own understanding, it's justified, it's supported, even in what Sri Ramakrishna said, that this is the view of the Advaitic Vigyani. It's just he's projecting that view
exactly onto the text,
his interpretations of the text.
Onto the text, exactly.
And the point of pointing all this out, is it to potentially protect against the extremism of something like neo-Advaitism, of really dismissing, uncompromisingly, unrelentingly, the world, anything happening, no practice necessary, nothing's really happening anyway.
Yeah.
Is that the point of you bringing up these discrepancies?
Well, that's not the point. It's an interesting point that you raise about Neo-Advaita, and one of the dangers of this Neo-Advaita movement, I think one can say parallel things about the Neo-Buddhism movement, which is kind of, and the Neo-Yoga movement, which is, the Neo-Yoga movement would be Ashtanga Yoga minus the Yama Niyama, so minus the first two limbs, minus the ethical practice and the ethical foundation. So what's left is this stuff. And So with regard to Advaita Vedanta, I'll tell you an anecdote which is relevant to what you're asking. Before I joined the order in 2010, I was doing a 6-month pilgrimage in India. And one of the places I visited was Kodaikanal. It was a beautiful place in the mountains. And I walked into a bakery, and I was wearing, not gerua, but it was like white brahmachari clothes. And the baker saw my clothes, and she thought maybe I was going to be a monk or something. She said, "Oh, you look like a spiritual aspirant. What are you going to do?" I said, "Well, I'm going to join the Ramakrishna mission, become a sannyasi." Then she had this smile on her face. She says, and looking at me like I was a 5-year-old child, and she said, "Why go to all that trouble? Why don't you just dive into the Atman?" Why don't you just dive into the Atman? Then it turns out, she told me that she was a follower of Ramana Maharshi. And Ramana Maharshi makes everything seem so effortless, because at the age of 16, after his uncle died, he just sat on the floor in Shavasana, and he contemplated death, and he had this breakthrough enlightenment experience. And so there is this kind of neo-Advaitic tendency to think that everything is very easy, and that all you have to do is say that you are the Atman, and then that's enough. You don't have to actually transform your life. You don't have to renounce anything. And your question is that one of the reasons I'm pushing against Shankara's interpretation? That's not one. See, I mean, in different contexts, I would give different answers, but the context here is we have a text in front of us. The particular text in question is the Isha Upanishad. And the question is, what's the best way to interpret this text? Right? I mean, there are texts all over the place. Are there any signs here? So there might be a sign which says, be quiet during arati. And if somebody comes along and says, what it means is shout during arati, don't you have a right to say this guy is, this interpretation is far-fetched? It's in that sense that I'm pushing against Shankara's interpretation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so Maharaj is saying that apart from his commentaries, he wrote stotras which are full of devotion. One question from a scholarly standpoint is whether those stotras he's thinking of, like Bhaja Govindam and these other ones, are actually his. And so many people think they were not his, that they were written by later authors. Yeah, there's a question of whether they were really his. So one thing that, when I was in training center in Belur Math, one thing one of my acharyas said, who is a great scholar of Shankara, what he said is, if you want to understand what Shankara himself taught, you must base your understanding only on his commentaries on the Prasthanatraya, on the 3 Vedantic pillars, the Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita, and Brahma Sutra. And the reason he said that is because those are definitely known to be his. So if you want to claim that Shankara was a bhakta, you have to prove it on the basis of his commentaries. So that's what I would say in response to that, yeah. And I think you had a question in the back.
Maharaj, given that we are all followers of Sri Ramakrishna and that is our gold standard, and because he himself was initiated, taught, and by a confluence of many spiritual teachers, including the very staunch Advaitins like Nangta, who are of the Shankara school. So can we say that essentially, if Sri Ramakrishna were to say something about this Shankara's interpretation, he would say, that's right and this is right. in the sense that, yes, for a certain aspirant, maybe. I'm not sure if I'm phrasing the question right, but I'm just thinking from Sri Ramakrishna's standpoint, who is the greatest harmonizer of all seemingly contradictory viewpoints. What would he say about Shankara's staunch point of view?
Yeah, we don't have to ask it as a hypothetical question. He talks about it directly. And he says that Shankara's Advaitic philosophy corresponds to what he calls the Guyana stage of spiritual realization. He says it's like when a salt doll goes to measure the depth of the ocean, and the moment it sets foot in the ocean, it melts in the ocean. So he says he's from a phenomenological standpoint, he's explaining the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi. When we attain the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi, we are Brahman. There's not even becoming Brahman or becoming one with Brahman. You can't even say that. You just are Brahman. And there's nothing but Brahman. Where is the world in that state? So in that state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi, you really feel there's no question of a world, let alone that you can't even say it's unreal. There just is no world. There's just Brahman. That's the state, that corresponds to the spiritual state of Jnana. Then he says, and this comes to your question, which is how does Sri Ramakrishna harmonize Totapuri's kind of teachings on Advaita Vedanta, Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya, with the Vigyani kind of realization, Brahma Satyam Jagat Satyam? By saying that, after the attainment of jnana, there's a further stage, an even greater stage of spiritual realization, which he calls Vigyana. And remember the analogy that I mentioned last week, which
I was not here last week. Sorry.
Oh, I see. Okay, you got to watch the lecture, but it's on YouTube. So he says that the spiritual aspirant climbs up a staircase, saying neti neti, saying the Brahman is not this, it's not that, it's not that, until he reaches the roof. What does the roof signify? Nirvikalpa Samadhi, the state of Brahma Jnana. That's the Jnani. And then Sri Ramakrishna says, the Vigyani sees something more. He sees that the steps are made of the same material as the roof, bricks, lime, and brick dust. The Vigyani sees that Brahman has become the 24 cosmic principles. And this is exactly what Sri Aurobindo says. Last week I mentioned this also, that Sri Aurobindo had sequential spiritual experiences. The first one was under Lele, Vishnu Bhaskar Lele, and it was Nirvikalpa Samadhi, and he had this feeling that this world was a dream and that the only reality was Brahman. 1 year later, when he was imprisoned in Alipur jail, he had a Vigyana kind of experience where he saw Vasudeva in everything, in the prisoners, in the murderers, in the bars of the cell, in the blankets that he was sleeping under. You see what I mean? So that's the way he harmonized these different philosophical standpoints on the basis of sequential stages of spiritual experience, namely jnana and then vijnana.
If the temperament suits you, so that's your path. If what Shankara is trying to teach, if that suits your temperament, so that's your, just follow that.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, he would, of course, teach, those who temperamentally like Shankara, then they can practice Shankara. Those who are temperamentally, they lean toward Bhakti, they can practice Bhakti.
Ramakrishna gave all catch-all statement,
Yeah, no, that's right. But I think his question is a bit of a deeper one. It's one thing to say it, but how do you actually prove that the different paths are equally true? So Sri Ramakrishna's idea is that God is infinite and is both personal and impersonal. So the Advaitin realizes the impersonal aspect of the divine reality, and Bhaktas realize different forms of the personal aspect of the same infinite divine reality. So that would be the ontological explanation of how all the different paths can be equally valid. Maharaj?
The first is compared his Guru, Tatapuri also, for his completeness of this understanding that you...
Yeah, thank you, Maharaj. That's also, there's a kind of a sequel to his whole, the incident with Totapuri, the 6-month kind of. So he was first instructed by Totapuri, and Totapuri taught him Advaita Vedanta. In a matter of 3 days, Sri Ramakrishna attained Nirvikalpa Samadhi, and Totapuri was completely stunned because it took him something like 40 years to accomplish the same thing. After he came back down to the relative plane, what happened was very interesting. Totapuri had this wonderful disciple, so he stayed much longer than he usually would. And then Totapuri, he was also a Brahmagyani. He was a Jivan Mukta, but he had a terrible stomach problem. It was so painful to him, and he already knew he was not the body, and the body is just this ordinary thing. Let me discard this body. Let me drown myself, because I've already realized myself as Brahman. So he goes to try to drown himself, and lo and behold, he's not able to. And this was Sri Ramakrishna's play, actually, because then he had this realization that this whole world, everything that was happening, his attempted suicide, was all the play of the Divine Mother. And the way that Sri Ramakrishna put it is that he then became the guru to Totapuri, to his own guru, and taught him something extra beyond the Advaita that Totapuri had taught him. He said, you have to accept Shakti also. Brahma Shakti Abhed, that's the Bengali teaching. Brahman and Shakti are inseparable aspects and equally real aspects of one and the same divine reality. And one last question, I think you had.
Swami, just a thought came, so semi-question. We say neti neti and iti iti, but it looks like even in the way Sri Ramakrishna taught, in the early phases you still have to separate vidya and avidya. Not everything is iti iti until you get to a stage where after which you can probably say everything is iti iti, right?
Yeah, no, that's good. So, so you're saying that even Sri Ramakrishna would teach that first you have to go through a neti neti, then you reach the iti iti. I think that's absolutely right. The question is, how do you understand the neti neti process? The strict Advaitin will say neti neti in the sense that this is not real, that is not real. Sri Ramakrishna would say sat asat vichara, which means this is the only permanent, the only eternal reality is God. Everything else is impermanent, anitya. Even Gita says the same thing. Anityam asukam lokam imam prapya bhajasvamam. It doesn't say mithya jagat. It's saying it's anitya. It's impermanent. It's not eternal. So you can do the neti neti without subscribing to the Advaitic doctrine that the world is unreal. Sri Ramakrishna on every page of the gospel is teaching to renounce lust and greed. So there's no question of that. There has to be renunciation in the spiritual practice. That's neti neti, but it doesn't mean that you have to believe the world is unreal. Thank you for the excellent questions. Oh, okay, go ahead. So there's some online questions, so we can answer one or two. Yeah.
Okay. First, we have, even if we imagine God in all beings, will it benefit us since we have not realized it yet?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, Swami Vivekananda would answer an emphatic yes, and he would say that this is the practice of what he called practical Vedanta. He also learned this from Sri Ramakrishna. Sri Ramakrishna taught him one day, Shiva Gyani Jiva Seva, which means serve everyone in the spirit of worship by seeing God in everyone. This is done spontaneously by the Vigyani or by realized souls, but it's done as a practice for spiritual aspirants. So it's a very practical kind of sadhana, spiritual practice for us who have not yet realized God, trying to practice seeing God in everyone as a way of serving God and helping humanity. Yeah.
And then I think the previous question covered this, but just for the person who asked it, I want to they asked, is jnana a mandatory step before vijnana?
Yeah, I think it is. I think according to Sri Ramakrishna, you cannot attain vijnana without first having attained jnana. Why? The answer is what I just said, which is about it's about ontology. God has both personal and impersonal aspects. By attaining the state of jnana, we become one with the impersonal aspect of God, which is Brahman, non-dual Brahman. So you have to realize the impersonal aspect of God. Only then can you become a bhakta and realize that that same Brahman is also Shakti, and as Shakti is manifesting as the 24 cosmic principles. So the Vigyani has a more comprehensive, a more expansive realization of God than the Gyani, or even ordinary bhaktas. Ordinary bhaktas think of God as in some personal form. Vishnu, Jesus, the different Krishna, right? And the Advaitin only realizes the impersonal aspect by realizing that his or her true nature is the impersonal non-dual Atman, the attributeless, or some people like to say transpersonal Brahman. But it's definitely not personal. The Vigyani, after realizing the impersonal, realizing that in his or her essence, he is one with Brahman, he is nothing but that Brahman, also realizes that Brahman is inseparable from Shakti. That's why in the passage I read last week, Sri Ramakrishna would say, Vigyani dakhe jini nirgun tini shagun. The Vigyani sees that reality which is nirguna is also saguna. That reality which is transpersonal is also personal. So you can't have the Vigyani's realization until you've realized the impersonal dimension of the infinite divine reality. Thank you. Yeah, exactly. Yes.
And the final question here. In the classification of para and apara vidyas, Vedas are also classified as aparavidya.
Aparavidya, yeah.
Aparavidya. Vedanta, being a part of the Vedas, automatically falls into the aparavidya category. Is then paravidya something subtle and different from anything expressed as textual knowledge?
Yeah, that's a good question. This person is referring to a mantra from the Mundaka Upanishad, which distinguishes aparavidya, the lower knowledge, from paravidya, the higher knowledge. And this person is pointing out, rightly, that aparavidya includes all the Vedas, including itself. So it's like self-referential and saying the text you're currently reading itself belongs to the lower knowledge. So what is the higher knowledge? The higher knowledge is realization, spiritual realization. It's the expression. Tadaksharam adigamyate. It's that through which you realize the akshara, the ultimate reality. And so, yeah, one thing that Swami Vivekananda pointed out about the Hindu scripture, he says it's the only religious scripture in the world which says that the scripture itself has to be transcended. That you don't stop with the scripture. It's not the be-all, end-all. It's just a means to the end of God realization, of spiritual enlightenment.
Thank you, Maharaj.
Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.